Welcome to the final lecture for this class. The focus will be to finish up the fighting in the Second World War and the Cold War. There are a few themes to be addressed in this presentation. First of all, we're going to continue with World War II, the battlefront, and explore the fighting in the Pacific. Second, we'll address the Cold War, which really began about 1947 and extended until 1989. This divided Eastern and Western Europe. We'll look at some of the factors as to why it developed and some of the policies addressed by the nations involved, and then we'll see how it came to an end. So the first topic would be back to the Second World War and the efforts to defeat Japan. The United States implemented a unique strategy to defeat the Japanese during the Second World War. It was called island hopping. See, the distances were so far in the Pacific Ocean that the United States had to go from island to island in the Pacific in order to attack the Japanese mainland. The arrow here points to Pearl Harbor. That was the furthermost naval base that the United States had in the Pacific. But then the Americans had to go from island to island in order to get to the Japanese mainland. And as you see, Japan is circled on this map. They simply couldn't go and attack Japan immediately because the distances were too great. The Japanese successfully caught the Americans off guard when they attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Immediately after that, they continued their success in different parts of the Pacific. That is, until the Americans won a decisive victory at the Battle of Midway. The green arrow here shows the location of Midway. This allowed the Americans to begin this strategy of island hopping. Midway was important because this proved to be the turning point in the war in the Pacific. Taken collectively, the fighting between the Americans and the Japanese in the Pacific was incredibly bloody. At the Battle of Iwo Jima, between February and March of 1945, nearly 7,000 Americans died as compared to the 21,000 Japanese deaths. Yet the Japanese refused to surrender. The fighting continued as they grew closer to the Japanese mainland at Okinawa. 12,500 Americans or Allied were killed, as compared to 100,000 Japanese soldiers who were killed, and 80,000 Japanese civilians who were either killed or wounded. Yet the Japanese refused to surrender. As they grew closer to the Japanese mainland, the number of kamikaze attacks or suicide attacks increased. Here we see a photo of the USS Essex, which was struck by a kamikaze plane in the fall of 1944. The city of Tokyo itself was firebombed in March of 1945. Over 2 days, several incendiary devices were dropped on the city. Probably about 80,000 civilians were killed, and over 250,000 buildings were destroyed. Yet the Japanese refused to surrender. In April of 1945, as the fighting raged in the Pacific, Franklin Roosevelt was having his portrait painted as he was sitting at that chair and table located on the left. He then declared that he had a terrible headache. Later that day he died. On the right, we see the unfinished portrait that never was completed as a result of the president's death. The new American president is shown here, Harry S. Truman. He served as Roosevelt's vice president. He didn't even know that the United States was working on an atomic bomb. 3 months after he assumed the presidency, the United States detonated a bomb in New Mexico. Then the United States issued an ultimatum to the Japanese. They warned Japan that they would have to surrender or face utter destruction. The Japanese refused to surrender and rejected that ultimatum. Then on August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima immediately about 100,000 Japanese died. Maybe about another 100,000 over the next 10 years. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, and immediately 40,000 Japanese died. Maybe another 40,000 over the next subsequent 10 years. Eventually, August 14th, the Japanese did surrender. The Second World War was the bloodiest war in world history up to that time. The number of military and civilian deaths were devastating. The Soviet Union suffered the worst casualties. As you see here, maybe 13 million military deaths and 7 million civilians. These are minimum figures. The chart is completed here. I don't want to minimize the number of American casualties at 400,000. However, if you compare and contrast the number of American deaths to other countries, other nations were truly devastated by the war. The Allied powers were victorious as a result of the Second World War. However, a Cold War developed due to mutual mistrust beginning in 1947. I don't know if you remember that photo from the previous lecture, but this shows the Big Three at Yalta. Once the common enemy of Germany was defeated, this alliance that was crucial to the Allied victory in the Second World War began to crumble. Here we see a photo of Comrade Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. He had several concerns which led to his mistrust of the West. They mainly focused on the lack of a second front during the Second World War, while his country lost 20 to 30 million people. Once again, here's another slide from that previous lecture. If you remember, Stalin's goal for victory in the Second World War was the creation of a second front to take pressure off of his own country. It didn't come until 1944 with that D-Day invasion in northern France. Meanwhile, 20 to 30 million of his people had died. Here we see President Harry Truman. The Americans also had concerns and a mistrust of the Soviets. This centered on the fact that communism led to a lack of civil liberties, like a lack of free speech, freedom of religion. Once again, here we have a posting from a previous lecture. However, remember that Cathedral of Christ the Savior? That was a cathedral initially built to celebrate the victory over Napoleon. Well, that was torn down by Stalin, and it was designed to be replaced with a communist museum. We can also see this mutual mistrust developing over Poland and Japan. See, Poland was a symbol of the Second World War. When Germany invaded Poland, that's when the British and the French declared war on Germany. Well, the Soviets never allowed free elections to take place in Poland after the war. Remember that Yalta Conference? One of the provisions of the treaty that was developed at that conference was that free elections would be held in Poland. They actually were held in the 1980s. So why did Stalin never allow these elections to take place? Well, he wanted to protect his country and establish a buffer or a zone in Eastern Europe to prevent another country from invading Russia. For example, if we just look at the past, Russia had been invaded several times. Napoleon had done so in 1812, and Germany had done so during World War I and in World War II. Stalin wanted to protect his country by establishing this buffer zone around Russia. Well, we also see this concerning Japan. See, the Americans denied the Soviets any influence over the reconstruction of Japan in the years after the war. After all, the Americans argued, it was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that brought the Americans into the war, and the Americans had borne the brunt of the fighting in the Pacific. So what we see here is a war of words and ideologies emerged, and at times it became hot, or it became a fighting war. The Soviet control of Eastern Europe was recognized in 1946 when Winston Churchill delivered a speech where he declared that an Iron Curtain was surrounding the nations of Eastern Europe. The arrows here point to this Iron Curtain around Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. This demonstrated the sphere of Soviet influence. As a result of this mutual mistrust, each nation began to develop different policies against one another. The first of the policies developed were attributed to this man shown here. Initially, he was only recognized as Mr. X, but over the years we discovered that it was George F. Kennan, an American diplomat and expert in Russian history. He argued that there was nothing that we could do about the areas where the Soviet Union already had under control. The Soviets already had control of the circled area here, and they had influence in these regions beyond their own borders, but there was nothing that they could do about it. However, Kennan continued from there. Any and all expansion by the Soviet Union had to be contained. Now the question was, how are you going to contain them? He argued that first you should negotiate. Next, use economic sanctions. If you need to, you should use force, but only as a last resort. This was important because it was the foundation of the Allies' foreign policy for the entirety of the Cold War. After that philosophy of containment was adopted, different specific policies were put into place that were influenced by this. We'll explore those next. I'd like to start with a bit of background. After the Second World War, a civil war broke out in Greece and Turkey as there were anti-communists fighting against communists. Initially, the British were supporting these anti-communist forces, but then they no longer could do so. They asked the Americans to step in. The arrows here are pointing to Greece and Turkey. The fear was that if communist forces were victorious in Turkey and Greece, well, what would happen to the rest of Western Europe? President Harry Truman went to Congress and asked them to support his Truman Doctrine. First, this provided cash, $400 million, to aid Greece and Turkey. Secondly, the Americans supported free people fighting against oppression anywhere in the world. Essentially, Truman, with the support of Congress and the American people, declared that the United States would serve as a global police force to fight communism. The Truman Doctrine was successful in Greece and Turkey. However, concerns were raised about events in the rest of Europe. The Secretary of State of the United States, George Catlett Marshall, is shown here. He developed a plan in 1948. See, Europe was absolutely devastated by the fighting in the war. Here we see some images of the aftermath of the war in Cologne, Germany. The Marshall Plan had a twin pair of goals. First of all, it was designed to provide humanitarian aid to people who clearly were suffering. But at the same time, it was also designed to fight communism. The fear was that people would seek radical alternatives like communism if things got to be too worse. So, the United States gave $17 billion to different European nations to help their economic recovery. It was incredibly successful, and it helped to halt the spread of communism. This had other impacts as well. This had a huge impact on the American economy because Europe was the #1 trading partner of the United States, so this investment helped the Americans as well. This investment was repaid many times over the next few decades. Next, we'll address a crisis in Berlin. On the right, you see a close-up of the city of Berlin. See, as a result of the Yalta Conference, Germany was occupied by the Allied powers after the war. There was an American, British, French, and Soviet zone. Also, the city of Berlin also was divided. Here we see a wider map of Europe. The circled area shows Germany, east as well as west. The arrow is pointing to the city of Berlin. This ancient city, an important German city, was located in the eastern portion of Germany. The economy of eastern Berlin and eastern Germany was not doing well, and so many people began to leave eastern Berlin. The Soviets then established a blockade of all rail lines and highways to and from Berlin. This was in 1948. The question was, how would the Americans and the rest of the Allies respond? According to that containment policy, force was to be used only as a last resort. So what they did was that the Americans sponsored a series of planes that brought supplies every single day, several times a day, to the people living in Berlin for a year. Eventually, by 1949, the blockade ended. In 1961, a wall was built further dividing eastern and western Berlin. Eventually it came down, and you see a portion of it on the left. In June of 1963, President John Kennedy traveled to the Berlin Wall to demonstrate his support for the people of Berlin. He delivered a speech, and at one point he meant to say, "Ich bin Berliner," which means, "I am a citizen of Berlin," to demonstrate that he identified with them. However, he mispronounced it, and he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which means, "I'm a jelly donut." Well, I think we can give him a break on this one. As you can see with a photo of me on the right, when I saw some Berliners and I was in the country of Germany, I just had to have a bite. They were good jelly donuts. In this era, we see the development of a new alliance system emerging in Europe. One was called NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. These included several Western European nations that were anti-communist. They were led by the British and French, West Germany, Italy, and Turkey. The Warsaw Pact was the opposing alliance. These included several Eastern European nations who were communists. This included the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. This map demonstrates the new alliances formed with NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Over the years in this Cold War, several hotspots did develop. In the early 1950s, we saw the Korean War. Then beginning in 1950 and really extending until the 1970s was the Vietnam War. And then there was Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. While these hotspots did develop, by the 1980s, new leaders emerged, and we also see the end of the Cold War. We'll talk about that next. After 40 years of the Cold War, by the 1980s, the economy in the Soviet Union actually was suffering, and the Russian people began to tire of the strict government control over their lives. A new leader emerged in that decade. On the right, you see the cover of Time magazine from 1985. This shows Mikhail Gorbachev, who became the leader of the Soviet Union in that year. He implemented a pair of reforms, glasnost and perestroika. The first of these policies was glasnost. A direct translation could mean openness. For the first time in decades, the Soviet government allowed for freedom of speech. There was open criticism of the government. Free elections also were held. Perestroika focused on the economy and restructuring of the economy. This allowed for some competition and some capitalism. The goal was to try to revive the Soviet economy, which was sluggish, and improve people's standard of living. While these reforms were put into place to try to help the economy, it continued to struggle in the Soviet Union, and it was impossible for the Russians to maintain their control over several European nations. By the late 1980s, several revolutionary movements emerged. In 1989, the German people rebelled, and Germany became reunified. On the right, you see someone literally chopping down or breaking down the Berlin Wall. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Cold War with these two events came to an end. Here we see a pair of maps. On the left, you see Europe during the Cold War and the divisions between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. On the right, you see toward a European Union or a post-Cold War Europe. Well, I'd like to see if we can summarize some of the main ideas included in the presentation. This presentation had two main topics. The first dealt with the Second World War and the fighting in the Pacific. This culminated in the decision to use an atomic bomb against the Japanese. The second topic was the Cold War. Once the common enemy of Germany was defeated, mutual mistrust developed between the Americans and the Soviets. Policies were developed by each side. However, by 1989, the Cold War had come to an end. What you want to be able to do is you want to be able to identify key policies developed during the Cold War and evaluate them. Well, this ends our final presentation for the semester. Take care, and good luck on the final exam.